All right, let's dive into one of the most pivotal moments in all of human history. We're talking about an event that didn't just change the world, it literally created the one we know today.
So just try to imagine this for a second. For thousands and thousands of years, you have the Americas over here and the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia over there. And they are two completely separate universes. Different plants, different animals, different cultures. They don't even know the other exists. And then, boom, 1492. They collide. So what happens when you smash two worlds together like that?
Well, that very first contact set off this enormous chain reaction. It kicked off a massive two-way transfer of pretty much everything you can think of: plants, animals, people, technology, ideas, and, as we'll see, germs. And it would change everything.
And that's exactly what historians call the Columbian exchange. This isn't just a story about explorers planting flags. It's really about the deep, messy, biological, and economic rewiring of the entire planet, a process that brought both incredible new connections and, frankly, unbelievable devastation.
And make no mistake, this was absolutely a two-way street. The Americas gave the world things like potatoes, maize, tomatoes. I mean, can you even imagine Italian food without tomatoes? Or chocolate? In return, the Old World brought over wheat, rice, and sugarcane. And they introduced animals like horses, cattle, and pigs, which completely changed life in the Americas. But, you see that last row? They also brought something else, something invisible and absolutely deadly.
And that brings us to the most immediate and by far the most devastating part of this whole exchange: the biological impact. For the people of the Americas, it was nothing short of a bombshell.
Just look at this number: 90%. That is the best estimate for the population decline of the indigenous peoples of the Americas in the century or so after Europeans arrived. And this wasn't mainly from warfare, it was from disease. You see, the people in the Americas had been isolated for millennia, so they had absolutely no built-up immunity to Old World diseases like smallpox, measles, and the flu. We're talking about germs that have been circulating in Europe and Asia for centuries. This event is often called the Great Dying. In so many places, disease spread faster than the explorers themselves, wiping out entire communities before a single European soldier even showed up. And to really get a sense of the scale here, just look at the Incan Empire. Around 1530, it had a population of roughly 9 million people. 100 years later, it had collapsed to maybe 500,000. That is just a catastrophic, almost unimaginable loss of life.
Okay, but here's the other side of that coin. While the New World was facing this demographic collapse, something completely different was happening across the Atlantic. The Old World was on the verge of a massive population boom, and it was being fueled by all these new foods coming from the Americas. So how did this work? Well, take the humble potato. It could grow almost anywhere, even in poor soil, and it was packed with calories. It quickly became a staple food that allowed places like Ireland and Eastern Europe to support way more people than ever before. Same story with maize or corn. This incredible influx of calories helped trigger a huge population explosion all across Europe, Asia, and Africa. So the biology of the planet was being scrambled, but so was the economy. The Columbian exchange completely rewired the entire global economic system, shifting the balance of power in ways that, honestly, we still feel today. The big story here was silver. The Spanish discovered these unbelievably rich silver mines in places like Potosí in what's now Bolivia. It was like finding a buried treasure chest the size of a continent. And all of a sudden, this massive flood of wealth starts pouring across the Atlantic and into Europe. And the result? It completely flipped the economic map of Europe on its head. For centuries, all the power was in the Mediterranean. Think Venice, Genoa. But now, with all this trade crossing the Atlantic, new cities like London and Amsterdam became the new centers of global finance. And all that new money, all that capital, it eroded the old feudal system and helped lay the very foundations for what we now call capitalism.
So you've got this new economic world taking shape. But to run it, the European powers needed to build a whole new social order in the Americas. And they did it by imposing these incredibly rigid, top-down social structures.
One of the first of these was something called the encomienda system. Now, on paper, the idea was that Spanish settlers were supposed to protect and Christianize the local indigenous people. In exchange, they could get labor from them. But the reality? It was a brutal system of forced labor and tribute. It was basically slavery, just with a different name.
Now, remember the Great Dying we talked about?
As the native populations were devastated by disease, the European colonizers found themselves without a labor force for their incredibly profitable mines and sugar plantations. And their solution was horrific. They turned to Africa, leading to a massive, horrifying expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, forcing millions of enslaved Africans into brutal conditions in the Americas.
And to keep all this under control, the Spanish in particular developed what's known as the casta system. You can think of it like a pyramid. It was a super rigid social hierarchy based entirely on your race and where you were born. At the very top, you had Europeans. In the middle were people of mixed heritage, and at the very bottom, you had indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. This whole system was designed for one thing: to keep power firmly in the hands of the Europeans.
Okay, so we've seen this biological, economic, and social earthquake. But let's zoom out. What does it all mean for us, right here, right now? What is the lasting legacy of this exchange?
Well, if you boil it all down, you can really see it as a transformation on three key levels. Biologically, it forever reshaped the planet's ecosystems and its people. Economically, it shifted the world's center of gravity to the Atlantic and really lit the fuse for modern capitalism. And socially, it created these new racial hierarchies and patterns of inequality, many of which have proven to be incredibly difficult to undo.
In the end, what the Columbian Exchange really did was create the first truly globalized world. It was the moment that our modern interconnected world was born. Before 1492, you could talk about many different separate worlds. After 1492, there was really only one.
So I guess I'll just leave you with this question to think about. When you look at the world around you, the food on your plate, the global economy, the deep-seated inequalities that we still grapple with, how much of it is just an echo of that massive collision that happened over 500 years ago? It's pretty wild when you start to connect the dots.